theme these evenings has been and will be Adventism for the 21st century. And we got that started last night, but I want to twist it up just a little bit tonight, because I want to talk about Adventism for the 19th century. And why would I do that? For a simple reason. If you want to talk about Adventism for the 21st century, there are two components, right? For that to happen, you need the 21st century and you need Adventism. We're not talking about whatever for the 21st century. We're talking about Adventism for the 21st century. And to understand, even begin to understand the impact that Adventism might have on the 21st century, I think it'll be helpful for us to go back and discover what is it that really motivated the original Adventist pioneers. What was it that got them excited? What was it that gave tremendous power and force to this movement? Because I think that will be essential if we can understand the impact that Adventists had in another time and place. We can perhaps begin to see how that might apply and what resources there might be within Adventism for the 21st century. If we're going to forge ahead, it'll be necessary to know who we are, where we came from, and then you have a foundation to have an idea of where we might be going. So tonight, I want to take you to another chapter in Revelation, and like last night, we will go into one chapter and largely stay there. So it'll be helpful to you, I think, if you get out a Bible in whatever form that you have brought that tonight, and open it to Revelation chapter 10, because we'll be spending our time largely there. The title is When Time Will Be No More. And that's one way to translate a portion of Revelation 10. So Revelation 10 is in two parts. So as you read through it, you will notice that there's like two different things going on. First of all, in verses 1 through 7, you have an angel and a little scroll. And everything's going on about the angel and the little scroll. Then, in the last half of the chapter, verses 8 to 11, John, the author of the Gospel of Revelation, undergoes a great disappointment. And that disappointment is described in terms of an acted parable in which John is instructed in the vision to take this little scroll that the angel was holding and eat it. I'm not sure what exactly that experience would be like. But when he eats the scroll, it's delicious. But he gets a sour stomach. So it's a mixed experience. So let's get into chapter 10 and see what it might have in store for us, because this is the chapter that energized the Adventist pioneers and brought them to a sense of mission and purpose like they had never had before. And that was the power of the movement all through the centuries that have come since. So let's start with Revelation 10 and verses 1 and 2. And you'll notice I've highlighted just a couple of words, and I'll explain that when we're done. Then I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven. He was robed in a cloud, with a rainbow above his head. His face was like the sun, and his legs were like fiery pillars. But right now, your head is already spinning, right? I mean, there's all kinds of stuff going on here that's a bit overwhelming. And then it goes even further. It says he was holding a little scroll in his hand, and it lay open in his hand. He planted his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land. Now, it doesn't sound like somebody just standing on the beach with one foot wet and the other foot in the sand, right? It sounds like this is really big. This is a huge angel who plants his one foot on the land and the other foot in the ocean, and you realize the tremendous size of this angel. So it's a dramatic way to say something really important is about to take place. So you have an angel, and he's holding a little scroll in his hand, which is open. Now, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, is there any scene in the Old Testament that might be recalled here? A little scroll that's open. If you go back to Daniel and chapter 12, Daniel ends with a scroll that's sealed up and shut, and nobody can look into it. And Daniel is sad that the message of that scroll is not going to come to him, but it's locked up for another time. Is it possible that in Revelation 10, John is saying, remember that scroll in Daniel? Remember that it was sealed up for the time of the end? Is that what Revelation 10 is all about? We will pursue that possibility. But here's an artist's description of this mighty angel who is holding this little scroll in his hand. Exactly what John saw, we don't know, but the artist here was attempting very hard to give an idea of what that might be like. In Daniel 12, verse 4, it says, "Close up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there to increase knowledge." So when the early Adventists read Revelation 10, they came to the conviction, could that be Daniel's scroll? Because when they read Daniel, they were saying, wow, there's a message here that's locked up until the time of the end. Could Revelation 10 be telling us this is what that was all about? The time has come for that scroll to be opened. The time has come for the message of God, the last message to the world, to go out. That was the question. That was in the minds of the early Adventists who read Revelation 10 in the light of the book of Daniel. So let's move ahead and see if there's any light in that suspicion. Revelation 10, verses 5 and 6. It says, "The angel which I saw standing on the sea and on the land," you remember him? 1 foot on the land, 1 foot in the ocean. All right? "He raised his right hand to heaven and swore by the one who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and the things which are in it, the earth and the things which are in it, the sea and the things which are in it," he declares, "time will be no more." Wow. The early Adventists saw this text and said, time will be no more. This is the text that's going to give us the clues to the very end of history. And so this chapter became engrossing to them. They said, what can we learn about this? What is it trying to tell us today? But before you could get there, you have to take a closer look. Like we said last night, take a second look at the passage. Go a little bit below the surface and see more deeply what God is doing. So here you have the angel standing there, still got the scroll in his hand, and his other hand raised up to heaven. That's the picture John is seeing, and this angel says, time will be no more. What do you think that means? Sounds like the end of history, right? It definitely sounds like that, and it sounded like that to the early Adventists. But we got to take a closer look to fully understand what was going on there. So let's look at it again. Revelation 10, verses 5 and 6. "The angel which I saw standing on the sea and on the land, raised his right hand to heaven and swore by the one who lives forever and ever. Now, I have to let you in on a little secret if you don't know it already. The book of Revelation never quotes the Old Testament. And that's a shock, because there's 278 quotations of the Old Testament in the New Testament. So 26 books of the New Testament have 278 quotations of the Old, an average of more than 10 for a New Testament book, most of which are a lot shorter than Revelation. Revelation never quotes the Old Testament. And yet just about every scholar of Revelation that I know personally, whether they are Catholic or whether they are Protestant or whether they are Jewish, every single Revelation scholar pretty much that I know recognizes that Revelation refers to the Old Testament hundreds of times. Hundreds of times. Just give you a couple of examples. Babylon and Jerusalem. You can't see those terms in the book of Revelation and not realize this is echoing what was happening in the Old Testament. So Revelation is full of the Old Testament, but never quotes it. That's a fascinating thing. So when you're reading Revelation, you have to be sensitive to every word, every phrase, every hint that might be pointing you back to the Old Testament, which is where the meaning often lies. And that will be the case tonight. So here you have Revelation 10, verses 5 and 6. Is that referring to Daniel 12? We had a suspicion that maybe that angel with the scroll that's open just might be a hint of Revelation 12, where there's a scroll that's sealed up and closed. But now we're going to see an even more powerful connection. Revelation 10, 5 and 6, there's three things in this passage I want you to pay attention to. First, the angel was standing on the sea and the land. There's a location that has water in it. He raises his right hand to heaven, and he swears by the one who lives forever. All right, so those are three things I want you to notice about this text. Now look at Daniel 12 and verse 7. The man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, lifted his right hand and his left hand toward heaven, and I heard him swear by him who lives forever. Now take a closer look, and I'm going to highlight in colors the parts of Daniel 12 that are echoed in Revelation 10. You have a man above the waters of the river. There's a location that has to do with water. He lifts his right hand and his left hand toward heaven, and he swears by him who lives forever. Now, you might not be impressed with that. That's not a whole lot of stuff in common, is it? But here's the key. Revelation never quotes the Old Testament. That means the Old Testament is referenced by a word here, a phrase there, a theme somewhere else, a name. The barest hints call the reader to think about the Old Testament. In all of the book of Revelation, this is one of the 2 or 3 instances with the most major words in common with any Old Testament background. When you're familiar with how lightly Revelation touches the Old Testament, this is overwhelming. There's about 8 major words in common between Revelation 10 and Daniel 12. So once you've been through Revelation, as I have done, and sought to find every allusion to the Old Testament in the book, this runs out and slaps you in the face and says, if this isn't referring to the Old Testament, nothing is. All right? So you could see here this strong parallel between the two, between Revelation 10 and Daniel 12:7, and pretty much every scholar I've ever met of Revelation would tell you right off the bat, this is a clear allusion to Daniel 12. So what's it all about? Why would this be important? Why would the Adventist pioneers get so excited about this connection? Well, it's all about the book of Daniel and how it works together with Revelation as part of the unique package of Adventism. In Daniel 12, you have a location over the river. Angel raises his right hand to heaven, swears, and says, time, times, and half a time. Revelation 10, you have a location, standing on the land and the sea. You have raising the right hand to heaven. You have swearing in the same exact Greek words as the Greek translation of the Old Testament in Daniel 12. And this angel says, not time, times, and half a time, but time will be no more. So when the Adventist pioneers looked at this, they said, Daniel points forward to a time when the sealed scroll will be unrolled and its message will be made obvious to the world. That time would come after a time, times, and half a time. Revelation is saying time will be no more. Now remember, our first suspicion was time would be no more, would be the end of the world, right? That was our first suspicion. But it's beginning to look like maybe it's a little different than that. What Revelation is telling us is the time prophecies of Daniel will come to an end. The time prophecies of Daniel, the time, times, and half a time, the 2300 evenings and mornings, those prophecies will come to an end when the angel raises his hand and proclaims, time will be no more. So the time here is not the end of the world. The time is the end of Daniel's time prophecies. And the Adventist pioneers had been studying those and came to the conclusion that Daniel's time prophecies ended between 1798 and 1844. Now, I can't take time to unpack all of that tonight. I'm sure you've heard it in evangelistic meetings or other places. So the Adventist pioneers in the 1830s and 1840s were saying, wow, Daniel's time prophecies are ending right in our time. And it says, time will be no more. That's got to be important. We've got to pay close attention. And so they went to the link between Revelation 10 and Daniel 12. And here I have an illustration where you have the 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's chapters in the book of Daniel. So Daniel 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 are important to Revelation 10. I'll explain why in a minute. One of the best-known New Testament scholars of the 20th century was a man named C.H. Dodd. And he became well known because he studied the quotations of the Old Testament in the New Testament. Remember I said 278? Okay? He studied those carefully and discovered something nobody had seen before. The beautiful thing about the Bible, you can read it, and you can read it, and you can read it, and sometimes on the 4th reading or the 40th reading, you see something you never saw before. That's what C.H. Dodd did. And he discovered, to his surprise, that the New Testament doesn't quote the Old Testament as proof texts to prove a point. That's what we would do, right? If you quote the Bible, you're looking for texts that support what you're trying to present, right? Not the way the New Testament writers did it. The New Testament writers would quote the Old Testament as a pointer to the entire context in the Old Testament. That's a different way of using the literature of the past. Let me illustrate it. Have you ever read Matthew chapter 2, the Christmas story? And in the Christmas story, it says that because of Herod seeking to kill the babies, the parents of Jesus were to take him to Egypt. And Matthew comments, why did they take him to Egypt? Because the prophet says, out of Egypt I called my son. Have you ever looked at that and then gone back to Hosea, where it says, out of Egypt I called my son, and discovered that's not a prophecy at all? A lot of people have looked at that and said, it makes no sense. Why does Matthew do that? Matthew treats Hosea 11 as a prophecy of Jesus, but it's not a prophecy. It's the story of the Exodus being retold. Out of Egypt I called my son. I held him by the hand. I led him through the wilderness, etc. C.H. Dodd pointed out, Matthew quoted Hosea 11 for one purpose only, that you pay attention to the larger context. What was Hosea doing in chapter 11? He was telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt, Israel's past, and he was using that as a model for Israel's future. God will do another Exodus. Just like the Exodus from Egypt, God is going to lead his people out of Babylon one day. So the prophet used the language of the Exodus to talk about the future. And Matthew wanted you to bring all of that back into mind. Jesus coming would be a new Exodus. He would come out of Egypt. He would pass through the waters of baptism. He would go into the desert for how many days? 40 days. And then he'd go up on a high mountain and deliver his law to the people, just like Moses did on Mount Sinai. You see? Matthew was telling the story of Jesus as a retelling of the Exodus story in the Old Testament. So Matthew quoted that one verse from Hosea, not that that one verse explained everything, but that one verse pointed to the whole context of Hosea and how the Old Testament prophets used the Exodus as a prophecy of what God would do in the future. God would do a great mighty act in the future like the Exodus from Egypt. And Matthew says those prophecies are now fulfilled in Jesus Christ. He had to go to Egypt because, like Israel, he would come out of Egypt to enter into his ministry. So that's the key of what C.H. Dodd saw. So when you see the author of Revelation alluding to Daniel 12:7, what do you know? It's not about Daniel 12:7. It's about the whole context of Daniel 12:7. So here, let's go back to Daniel 8 through 12. That's the part of Daniel that's in the Hebrew language. The rest of Daniel is mostly in a different language, in the original. So in the Hebrew of Daniel, you start in chapter 8, and you have a vision of a ram and a goat, and then this prophecy of 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary will be cleansed. So Daniel 8 through 12 is all about this prophecy of Daniel 8, 9 to 14. In Daniel, the prophet would get a vision and then would get an explanation of the vision. In Daniel 2, he saw the vision of this great statue. And then Daniel says, King Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold, and after you will come this next nation, and after that, and after that. So he gets an explanation. The vision of Daniel 8 through 12 is in chapter 8. The vision of the 2,300 evenings and mornings. And then Daniel gets a visit from an angel. And the angel begins to explain to him in verses 15 and 26, explains to him about the vision of verses 9 to 14. But Before he finishes the explanation, Daniel faints. It's too big for him. And so the explanation isn't complete. In chapter 9, Daniel is praying for more understanding, and the angel comes back. And in verses 24 to 27, continues to explain what the vision of Daniel 8 was all about. But once again, he doesn't finish. And the explanation continues in chapter 11 and chapter 12 and climaxes in verses 5 to 13, where finally all the issues raised in Daniel 8 are explained. So you have a vision in Daniel 8. The rest of the book is explaining that vision. You got to look at the whole in order to understand any of the parts. So when the author of Revelation alludes to Daniel 12:7, he's pointing to this whole big picture of chapters 8 through 12. And the Adventist pioneers said, you mean Revelation 10 is unlocking the key to the book of Daniel? The book of Daniel brought us to the year 1844, and we're trying to figure out what's happening there. Revelation 10 is the key that will unlock the message of Daniel for the end of time. And so they went back to Revelation 10, and they found this: time will be no more. But in the days of the sounding of the seventh angel, when he is about to sound, the mystery of God is finished. The mystery of God is finished. What do you think that means? And the Adventist pioneers said, the mystery of God, the finishing of the mystery of God, that has got to be the end of all things. So when Daniel's time prophecies come to an end, the world will come to an end as well. The two are the same. And so William Miller proclaimed to the world that when Daniel's time prophecies come to the end, the world will come to an end. Jesus will return, and we'll all go home with him. Powerful message, timely message, gathered more interest. All the newspapers, it was front page stuff. William Miller came to town, it was on the front page of all the papers. This was the hottest news running around in the early 1840s in northeastern United States. But you all know what happened, right? The year, the day came. In fact, in the end, it was determined October 22, 1844 is the moment when Daniel's time prophecies came to an end. And the followers of William Miller expected that on October 22, 1844, Jesus would come. Powerful message, timely message. Thousands and thousands of people all over the northeastern United States were looking forward to that day. But William Miller missed one little word in the text. Remember what I said? Sometimes you have to reread it a few times before you see what you have missed. He missed one simple word, the word highlighted in purple there, but. What does but mean? It normally means something that cuts against the grain. This is true, but don't ignore that. This is true, but something else will qualify that. But in the days of the sounding of the seventh angel, when he's about to be sound, the mystery of God will be finished. Do you see that when time is no more, the mystery of God still isn't finished? There are days to continue before the seventh angel is about to sound. So William Miller got the date right, but missed the event. It wasn't the second coming of Jesus, and there was a great disappointment. Hiram Edson, one of those early Adventist pioneers, was one of the first to realize what the but meant. It didn't mean the end of this world. It didn't mean the second coming of Jesus. Instead, it meant something was happening in God's world. That cosmic conflict, something major was happening at that time that would have powerful implications here on this earth. Time will be no more, but in the days of the sounding of the seventh angel, when he's about to sound, the mystery of God will be finished. So the time no more actually comes within the sixth trumpet of Revelation. But the angel, the mystery of God, won't be finished till the seventh angel is about to blow his trumpet. So when the angel picks up the trumpet, takes in a breath, at that moment, the mystery of God is finished. But there's a period of time between the time no more and the finishing of the mystery of God. And that is what William Miller had missed. So the question is, what is the mystery of God? What is that would be finished? When the seventh angel is about to blow his trumpet, what is it that's being finished? And when you take a look at the original language, it doesn't say the mystery of God is preached. It says the mystery of God is gospeled. It's the word gospel as a verb. It's the final gospel proclamation. The gospel didn't end in 1844. Preaching of the gospel didn't close at that time, but continues for another period of time to follow. Ephesians 3 will help us understand what the mystery of God is. Take a quick side survey there. Paul says this: "The mystery was made known to me by revelation, as I've written briefly. When you read this, you can perceive my insight into the mystery of Christ, which is not made known to the sons of men in other generations, as it has now been revealed to his holy apostles and prophets by the Spirit." So the mystery of God is something that came to be known at the time when Paul was writing, at the time when Jesus was on this earth. This mystery is that the Gentiles are fellow heirs, members of the same body, partakers of the promise in Jesus Christ. Through the gospel of this gospel, I was made a minister. So the mystery of God is the gospel of Jesus Christ. Revelation 10 is telling us that a movement would begin around 1844 that would preach the final gospel message to the world. That's the mission that Revelation 10 set out for that point in time. The gospel will go forward one more time, but this time in the light of Daniel and Revelation, which prepares the way for that end time. So the mystery is the gospel, but it's a gospel that is uniquely fitted for the final days of Earth's history. An Adventism that is truly relevant must be what we expect in the 21st century. It cannot be a message that's 200 years old only, but it has to be a message that's powerfully relevant to the world today. And that's what we're talking about during these evenings. So let me give you a timeline here. The Daniel 10 is splitting up history into three parts. The first part is the time of Daniel's time prophecies. They began in the time of Daniel or a little bit after, and they worked their way through history all the way to the middle of the 19th century. Then, the angel of Revelation 10 says, time will be no more. That ended that first period, and then came a period in which the mystery of God continued to be proclaimed, a time Daniel called the time of the end. So the Adventist pioneers came to realize with 1844, we had entered into the time of the end, the very last period of Earth's history. How exciting that must have been to realize we just discovered in the Bible that the time we're living in right now is the most decisive period of human history. What an exciting discovery, and how exciting that could still be for today. And then at the end of that period, the preaching of the gospel would end, and when the angel sounds, that mystery is finished. It's what Adventists have called the close of probation. When no one on this earth needs the gospel anymore. When everyone has either accepted it or rejected it and say, I'm no longer interested. Time will be no more in that sense. That the finishing of the mystery. No need to preach anymore because everybody's made a decision. We're not in that time yet. But that's what is approaching ahead of us. That's what Revelation 10 is telling us. Ellen White talked about what we're talking about tonight in one passage that was recorded in the Bible Commentary, Volume 7, page 971. She says, this time, referring to Revelation 10, this time which the angel declares with a solemn oath is not the end of this world's history, neither of probationary time. You got that? It's not the end of the world, the end of phase 3. It's not the end of probation, the end of phase 2. It's neither of those. It's the end of prophetic time, which should precede the advent of our Lord. That is, the people will not have another message upon definite time. After this period of time, reaching from 1842 to 1844, there can be no definite tracing of the prophetic time. The longest reckoning reaches the autumn of 1844. You'd almost think she'd been here tonight, right? Because she's basically laying out what that text is saying as we've come to understand it. So you have history divided into 3 periods. The time of Daniel's prophecies, ending in 1844, the time of the end, which we're in right now, and then the very final moments of Earth's history after the preaching of the gospel is done. So that's what Revelation 10 is telling us. And it's telling us, yes, it's been almost a couple hundred years, but we still are living in the very last period of Earth's history. Up until then, people who have not heard this message, it's been 2,000 years, and we're still here. So that's why the end is not so urgent. But when we realize we are actually living in the very last period of Earth's history, and we don't know how long that period's going to be, the end is closer. And the Adventist pioneers were excited that they had been given the opportunity to give a special message. But here's where it gets interesting. In Revelation 10, it doesn't end with this proclamation that the mystery of God will be finished. But it goes on to tell this curious story. Then the voice that I heard from heaven spoke to me once more. Go, take the scroll that lies open in the hand of the angel who is standing on the sea and on the land. So I went to the angel and asked him to give me the little scroll. He said to me, take it, eat it. It will turn your stomach sour, but in your mouth it'll be as sweet as honey. I took the little scroll from the angel's hand and ate it. It tasted as sweet as honey in my mouth, but when I had eaten it, my stomach turned sour. Now here's the fascinating thing. This is the explanation of the vision. So whatever's going on here between John and the angel, it's about the vision we just studied. It's about a message that seems to proclaim the end of the world, but it doesn't. There's a but in there. There's a shift. There's a qualifier. And that is predicted here will be a great disappointment. And that's exactly what it was in 1844. In the words of Hiram Edson, one of those early pioneers, our fondest hopes and expectations were blasted. October 22, 1844. Such a spirit of weeping came over us as I've never experienced before. It seemed that the loss of all earthly friends could have been no comparison. We wept and wept till the day dawned. See, that was not a mystery to God. But to those who went through that experience with a partial knowledge of the text, the absence of Jesus' return on October 22 was a deep and crushing disappointment. It's a sober warning to anyone who thinks that they have the timing of the end all set out today. Exactly what's going to happen ahead of time. That has never worked well in the course of history. Prophecy is there not so much to satisfy our curiosity about the future, but to teach us how to be ready for that future. And then John puts the capstone on it in verse 11. The angel said to me, John tells us, you must prophesy again to many peoples, nations, languages, and kings. The disappointment of the early Adventists is echoed by John's disappointment. I can imagine that he expected this vision that came from God would be just the message that would bring the end in his day. But the angel says, no. That's not why I'm giving you this message now. I'm giving you this message for those who follow you. Your book will prophesy again. I mean, John was what, 90 at this time? So if he's told, you must prophesy again, that didn't sound too doable. But God is saying to him, look, this message I've given you, you will record it, and then it will be the impetus to prophesy for you to every people's, nations, language, and king. So the Adventist pioneers realized the mission of the time of the end is proclaiming that end-time message, proclaiming the book of Revelation, proclaiming the book of Daniel, proclaiming the everlasting gospel, packaging all that together, a unique gospel for the end time, completely connected to the gospel of the past, totally grounded in the gospel of Jesus Christ, but with a unique end-time flavor to get the world ready for the actual return of Jesus. So the Adventist pioneers became very excited because they saw they were not only living in the last era of Earth's history, but they saw that God had already foretold the message that would be powerful at that time. And what was that message? First of all, the time no more recalled Daniel. The book of Daniel would be understood and explained for the first time. The mystery of God is the gospel. So the gospel would have a final proclamation at that time. Prophesying again connected with the book of Revelation. So it's the end-time gospel in the context of Daniel and Revelation. That's the message the pioneers took away from Revelation 10, and that's become the foundation of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and its message. This is what got it all started. This is what got everybody excited. But is there more? Chapter 11, and by the way, the chapters of the Bible are not original. Okay? When John wrote Revelation, he didn't say, okay, chapter 10 now, verse 1. No, it's just written. You can see the manuscripts. It's simply written out as a continuous story without verse and chapter numbers. Those were added many centuries later. So it's not canonical that chapter 11 is different than chapter 10. Actually, it simply continues. The angel says to John, you must prophesy again. And then he says, John says, I was given by who? The angel of chapter 10. I was given a reed like a measuring rod. So this is part of the vision of Revelation 10. It's part of the explanation. I was given a reed like a measuring rod and was told, go and measure the temple of God and the altar and count the worshipers there. So the end time message Daniel, Gospel, Revelation, one more piece, a message about the heavenly sanctuary. You see what's happening here? The early Adventist message was not something that people simply made up. They got it out of their study of Revelation. When they studied Revelation, they saw that at the end of time, there was a period of time when a message needed to go to the world, and that Revelation actually gave what that message was. And they looked around and didn't see anybody proclaiming that message. Catholics weren't doing it, Protestants weren't doing it, Jews weren't doing it, Muslims weren't doing it. Nobody was doing it. And so they said to themselves, well, if this message is going to get out, somebody will have to do it. If not us, who? If not now, when? Is what they asked. And so they seized the message of Revelation as the core of their own preaching and belief system. And it wasn't only that, because as they continued through Revelation 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, we don't have time to do that this week, but there were other aspects of that final message that became clear. So the end time message that God placed within the book of Revelation was as follows. And I want you to pay careful attention because we're going to look more closely tomorrow at these. Daniel and Revelation, the gospel, and I've got texts next to each one, which if we had time we could go into in detail. A message about the heavenly sanctuary, keeping all the commandments of God, a warning of end-time deception, relationship with Jesus, the hour of judgment, and the Sabbath. The book of Revelation brings these ideas to the fore and says, this is the package of ideas that God has ordained would be proclaimed to the world in the last era of Earth's history. That's why the 19th century Adventists were so excited. And the question we're asking ourselves this week, what is it about this message that could connect with the 21st century? This is the message we've been given as a people. It was a wonderful message with great power and still has great power today in many parts of the world. But in many parts of the world, like North America, that message is not connecting with people the way it used to connect. So tomorrow night, we're going to ask the question, who is the remnant? And what is it that God is calling them to do? In the book of Revelation, there's a people at the end of time that would carry out that mission called the remnant. And to understand what that means will help us understand how this message can be more relevant than ever in the days just ahead. So God bless you as we consider these things this week. The Adventism for the 19th century, by the grace of God, must become an Adventism that is just as powerful in the 21st century. May it be so. Let's pray. Dear Lord, the book of Revelation is a challenging book. As we seek to understand it, and so many in this room have been seeking to understand it, studying carefully, learning from whatever source they could. I pray, Lord, that you would put your hand over all those studies. I pray that in studying Daniel and Revelation, none would forget the gospel of Jesus Christ, because without that, the end-time message would be hollow. May we be grounded in you. May we be grounded in your character, grounded in an understanding of this larger cosmic conflict of which this Advent message is a part. We pray, Lord, that you would be with us, that here in Alberta there might be a rebirth of a powerful Adventism for the 21st century. It's my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
And just the understanding that it's the same gospel all the way along, but with a different relevance as we go through different stages of salvation history, I think is tremendously important. That's what I got from your message.
I think that's an excellent summary.
Awesome. Dan, anything to add there?
I got that I want more. You showed how Paul said that the gospel wasn't revealed until his time, and then you showed that we're in a time of a renewal or an emphasis of more gospel, and I'm looking forward to hearing what that is.
That's we will cover that in the next 2 nights. Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome.
It would be a real disappointment to leave you here.
I would.
Yeah. Because I think one point that I would make very strongly,
Sure.
the timeliness of that 19th century was so powerful. And it was an era where people knew their history.
Yes.
So when you did Daniel and Revelation and you compared them with history and stuff, people knew that stuff.
Yeah.
And it had a ring of authenticity to them. You present the same message to the younger generation today, and they haven't learned that history.
Right.
History today, for better or for worse, I'm not, making a political comment or anything, but history today isn't as detailed, and many of the things that were thought important then are not thought important today.
Right.
And so the kind of history that backed up the pioneers isn't there in today's world. So to take the same message that I gave tonight and just say that's it, and people will say, well, so what?
Yeah.
That was 200 years ago.
What difference does it make to me?
And nothing's happened, so what's the deal?
Yeah.
So there has to be something more in that message that can rekindle the connection with a generation that doesn't know much about the 19th century.
That's right. I think it's been commented on that historical consciousness of people is changing, right? I think we're losing, perhaps through the internet, a sense of living in a discrete historical period. And through the internet, all these periods are available to us at once. So in the same evening, I can show my children a Buster Keaton silent movie and have them watch David Attenborough, Planet Earth, right? And then have them watch a documentary on the history of the Frisian people, from which the name Hamstra and all these Stra names like Boonstra, whatever, derives, right? And so all these things are kind of collapsed. Whereas when I was a young person, whatever was in the Blockbuster video store on TV was what you got to watch, right? And so you had a sense of having a different cultural experience than your parents, and then that, but that's all sort of gone, right? And everything from the past is sort of available all at the same time, and you sort of sample from it what you want, and you can leave the bits that you don't want, whatever doesn't interest you. I'm sort of thinking out loud, but how do we relate the Seventh-day Adventist prophetic message to people? It's really a feature of maybe meta-modernism or something like that, where it all comes in at the same time.
Yeah. Well, and before the Blockbuster store, before the video store,
right?
Basically, like 3 or 4 channels
Yeah.
for all of your news. If you wanted a movie, you went to the movie theater, or it happened to be shown on one of those 3 or 4 channels. So you might have one crack at it in 5 years,
Yeah.
etc. So everything was curated for you. But today, everything is available to everyone all the time.
Right.
And so everybody's picking and choosing, and we're not getting a common cultural experience.
That's right.
Our common culture is fragmentation.
Well, the good news I'm taking from what you're saying is that in the 19th century, God met people with a message that they understood, that was relevant to them. I'm blogging through Matthew right now, and I find Jesus constantly introducing his stories with the kingdom of heaven is like, which was relevant because the people of that day were expecting a kingdom.
That's right.
So he was speaking their language.
And they were not only expecting it in general, but they were reading prophecies of the Old Testament suggested it would be around 30 AD.
Yeah. So it was
When
like
Jesus
imminent.
came.
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't know, maybe that's something to develop, or something somebody here in the comments section has an interest in. We're just getting some comments here saying that we're seeing Dr. Paulien but hearing Debbie. I hope that's resolved. Okay, thank you very much. Tech people in the background, you can't see them, but they're working hard over there to make sure that we're on. I hope you didn't miss too much of that conversation, because I found it really stimulating. One thing, just a few. Okay, great. One thing that stuck out to me that maybe you might want to develop more, I don't know, but it sort of resonated with me, is when you went to Ephesians about the mystery of God and how it has to do with the reconciliation of the Jews and the Gentiles. And I thought of the Advent movement as doing somewhat of that, in that many of the Jewish practices that were lost from Christianity when it took an anti-Semitic turn in the early centuries of the church came to be recovered through the Advent movement. I mean, most prominently the Sabbath, but there are other things as well. I don't know if you want to comment on that at all.
Let me take that a step further,
Sure.
and it may anticipate a little what we're going to do the next couple nights. But growing up, because of Adventism as we knew it, I had a lot of interest in Judaism. Part of it was growing up in New York City,
Right.
and there were maybe 2 million Jewish people in New York City, more than you have in Tel Aviv,
Right.
in Israel.
Sure.
So New York City, a very Jewish town, and so I was quite familiar with a lot of that. Didn't know much about Islam. And September 11 came,
Yeah.
and I think many people, even if you were not born yet, you're at least familiar with that history, that story. And it was a devastating thing for those who lived in New York City.
Right.
Far beyond the tragedy of the lives lost, it was a trauma for the whole city. And the elder of the Adventist Church in Manhattan, the day after September 11, stood out in front of the church and just as people walked by says, "We're going to have prayer here. As you're welcome to join us if you'd like." And 50 people came in off the street
Amen.
and joined an Adventist prayer meeting that had never been darkened that door before. It was just, there was that much of a trauma and a need for something,
Seeking for
you see.
comfort and answers.
But here's where I'm going with this. About a month later, the seminary sent several teachers to New York City to explore what was going on there and maybe see if we could plant one of our teachers there. One who was skilled in evangelism, personal witnessing. That was his specialty. Could put him in a high-rise in Manhattan and have him reach out to people who are now more open than they were before. Anyway, this is a long story to say something really important to me.
Sure.
When we went there that time, there was a woman that was already beginning that kind of work in such an apartment. And her daughter was with her that weekend. And her daughter was Muslim and wore a hijab and all of that. And on Sabbath, we were just doing a nice Sabbath journey, visiting strawberry fields, where John Lennon was killed, and seeing the Shakespeare Pavilion, just wandering through the city, just seeing different sights and having a good Sabbath experience. And then the woman's daughter was with us. She said, "Is there any chance that we could go to a mosque?" She says, "I feel like I need to pray." And so, being an ex-New Yorker myself, we found the biggest, bestest mosque in Manhattan.
Sure.
Got on the subway and went over there. And when we got there, we were invited to observe, and there were like 100 or so men lined up for prayer,
Yeah.
and they all looked Arabic, but there was one guy that looked like me. And when the prayers were over, he made a beeline for me. What are you doing here? And we were talking, and then came out that I was a Seventh-day Adventist. And he says, "I've kind of heard about you guys. I have a question. What do Adventists have to say about the judgment?" And I gave him a 3-minute summary
Yeah.
of the investigative judgment, the millennial judgment, the end of the millennium, and all of that.
Sure.
And the guy looked at me, he said, "That is amazing. That's what I'm going to believe from now on." And I said, "What?" And I began to ask, what is going on with that? That made no sense. This was so relevant. What I discovered, and this is the start of this journey for me like never before. What I discovered that Islam is an eschatological religion.
Absolutely.
And it's all about the events of the end time and about the judgment. And the Adventist message of the judgment, what Muslims have told me over and over again, you have the same message that we have, but it's so much more structured. It makes so much more sense.
Wow.
We like it the way you say it.
Wow.
Now here's my point. That was sure a long prelude.
I enjoyed it.
But here's my point. The point is this. There are aspects of the Adventist message that don't seem to connect with the Western world,
Right.
like the investigative judgment. I found out that one of those neglected aspects of Adventism is central to the core of Islam and made them very excited about getting into the Adventist message. And it was the beginning of realizing that every piece of what God has given us is important, but it may not be important for my neighbor. It may be important for somebody else's neighbor. and that every aspect of it will play its role. So that was the start of a journey that you'll hear about in the next couple of nights.
Amen.
That I believe that Adventism will have a second wind when we find the ways that that message is relevant to today's world, where Jews and Muslims and others are mingled into every neighborhood we have. It is the opportunity for Adventism to expand beyond its Christian foundations and catch a new fire for today's world.
So if I'm catching you right, come out of her, my people, you're saying God has designed the Adventist message in such a way that it has tentacles that reach out into every different people group.
You're a quick study. That's where we're going. Yeah. That actually, because does it make sense that God would raise up a movement only to reach out to a few Christians?
Oh, for sure.
Or if it's truly worldwide, then somehow it's got to be relevant to more than just other Protestants.
Absolutely.
That's right. Yeah. That's beautiful. I guess in the moments that remain, what I feel a little bit like the Apostle Paul in that, I find myself able to reach everybody except my own people. You know what I'm saying? Young white men. Probably the hardest group in Canada to reach with the gospel, right? And that's what I'm looking for, is where does the Adventist message connect to them, right? Of my friends who were raised in the Adventist church that I grew up with back in Minnesota, biggest church in the conference. Basically, the only ones that are left in the church are the ones who are working for the church, and everybody else is gone. And maybe just to pull it back around, I don't want to answer my own question. I'll let you give your take on it. But for me, the character of God stuff seems quite important. And connecting that into the concept of the investigative judgment, right? As there are people in the church who have defiled God's character in His name, right? He's got to sort that out, right? The concept of the remnant. Not everybody who claims to be a Christian is a true Christian, right? You have to be discerning, right? And God has His people, but you can't always just identify them with how they identify themselves or to which organization they belong, right? Some of those things seem to me like promising avenues, but what's your take on that?
I think you're anticipating where we're going to go the next couple of nights. Tomorrow we're going to talk about what does the Bible say about the remnant. Is the remnant the Seventh-day Adventist Church, or is it something else? I think these are very important questions, and actually the General Conference has done significant study in the last 20 years, recognizing that there's some shortcomings in the way the message is getting across. And so I'll share some of that tomorrow, and then on Thursday I'll take you on a bit of a ride with some more of this beyond Christianity concept and where that might take us.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like we're just anticipating your future messages here, so maybe go ahead.
But maybe to summarize, so that something's clicking in my mind.
Sure.
Character of God is a major thing with this generation, but another one is they were born and raised with diversity.
That's right.
Which many of us were not.
Yeah.
And so very early on, they would, my own kids would get offended if anyone made an off-color remark about any other race or LGBT or whatever, and they say, these are people. You don't talk about them like that. And these are, my kids, when they were 12 and 13, were already ingrained with that.
Yeah, slurs are the new four-letter words.
Yeah.
Right? You can say all those words we were taught not to say as kids, but don't ever use a slur, right? You can't do that now. Yeah.
So an Adventism that isn't able to connect with all the diverse peoples that are now neighbors of ours is not going to have the impact that Revelation is predicting.
Right. And maybe especially that would be important in terms of religion, right? And I think you're going to want to pull that out. But let me just, maybe go into some dangerous waters here. It's kind of a dodgy thing to do as we wrap up. But the E word, right? Ecumenism, yeah? People are very afraid of an end-time movement that will unite all religions. But isn't there supposed to be a true that is the God's version of the counterfeit, right? Could it be that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is supposed to be part of a remnant movement that would bring people out of every different religion, every different background into the worship of God? Isn't that a kind of ecumenism that's a good sort of a thing? I'm asking rhetorical questions. You know what my answer is.
No, I think Ellen White didn't use words like ecumenism.
Yeah.
But I think she describes two different types of ecumenism.
Right.
There's the negative type.
Yes.
And that's where structures of religion try to get together in the interests of power and wealth, you know, to enhance their stand.
Yeah.
That is never a good thing.
Empire building.
Yeah, empire is never a good thing. It never results in a good thing when it comes to faith.
Right.
On the other hand, she cast a vision for going out and looking for kindred spirits
Exactly.
in every other place.
Exactly.
So, you know, the kind of structural thing we're supposed to avoid. But in doing that, we sometimes avoid talking to anybody. You see? And, you know, if you're terrified about, let's say, what an institution like the Catholic Church could do if it were in power, if you're terrified about that, you see a priest walking along the street, and you'll be terrified. You don't want to go near him.
Right.
You know, they might zap me or something. I'm being very outspoken in a sense, but I want to make an important point.
It is.
I've had some of the people who study Revelation are Catholic priests
Yes.
and nuns,
Yeah.
and some of them are the kindest and most welcoming people you want to know.
That's right.
And we've developed relationships, and I've learned things from them. They've observed things in the text that I had missed. You know, I remember one very, very major professor who's at Yale today. We were in a meeting, and she was saying something about Revelation. I said, no, it's not. And she said, yes, it is. And I said, no, it's not. She said, yes, it is. She said, read the text. To an Adventist, right? But I opened my Greek Bible and read it, and she was right. Somehow, the way I read it as an Adventist, that detail slipped me.
Yep.
I'd read it and read it and read it, and I didn't see it. So someone coming from a different angle entirely, and it didn't matter whether she was Catholic, Protestant, or Jewish, or whatever. The point is, she was able to see something that I had missed. And there have been times when I was shared with her that she had missed something, because maybe a Roman Catholic is going to miss certain details as well. So this seeking out kindred spirits, this is where the sharing takes place.
That's right.
And where the power of the Holy Spirit can work. I know it's a scary thing if you're not used to meeting people who are different from you. It's a very scary thing, but that's what we're called to do.
Yeah.
And if the message has power, if the message is the right message for this time, people are going to open themselves to it. And it'll be exciting to see that happen.
Amen.
Yeah, so coming back to what you said earlier, God doesn't say, he says, come out of her, my people. He doesn't say, come out of her and become my people.
Yeah, that's right. And I think Ellen White does say, doesn't she, that God has people in all these other places.
Many sheep I have.
That may be more than within the fold at this time.
Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful, and that's a great, I think, a humble vision for evangelism, right? Sometimes they have things to teach us, and I think that helps us to have that fruit of the Spirit that we need, humility, right? Wonderful point to end on. Unless you have a last comment you want to bring, or is
No,
that
I
right?
think I thought you ended it well.
Perfect. Friends, we'll be back here tomorrow night, same time, same place. Again, let us know what we should call this show if we keep doing it. I've been getting a lot of encouragement, so I think we will. So we need a name. Help us out.
Afterthoughts?
Afterthoughts. Hey, very good. There's a first one. This is why we bring in people from Loma Linda. All right. With that, we'll sign off. Good night, everybody.
Good night.